Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Lion. When you're doing a film that's based on a true story, especially a powerful true story, which Lion really is, oftentimes I feel like those movies can rely more on the fact that they have a powerful story than actual good filmmaking or story structure or understanding what you're exactly doing with your story. And Lion has a very powerful story behind it, and I think has a story that really doesn't get told enough in film, particularly about adoption and what adoption means for the family, how, you know, the people who raise you, no matter if they're your biological parents or who they are, definitely have a parental role in your life. But that doesn't make Lion a good movie just because of that, and Lion relies too much on that and relies on putting in information that doesn't exactly work from scene to scene, doesn't exactly work with its structure and its story, and doesn't really help this film by any means. Kind of your typical kind of Oscar movie, very Oscar baity, sympathetic, true story, you know, tug at your heartstrings type of thing. If this hadn't been nominated for Best Picture and all that, because I'm reviewing this after it got nominated, I would still say that, because that's really what it's doing. And in ways that a film like Hidden Figures really worked and soared and made decisions to make it work as a movie, Lion doesn't. Now, Lion has like two distinct real problems with it. One is that the first part of this film is far stronger than like the second part. The first part is him as a young boy getting lost in India. The second part is Dev Patel's character trying to find where he grew up after being lost and then, you know, adopted by an Australian couple and such. The first part is so strong, and people have compared it to kind of Spielberg direction. I would agree, it is in that vein. But then it tries to do these kind of like Malick-y kind of flow about it to kind of up the intensity, particularly in the Dev Patel parts, to kind of show how troubled he is, kind of doing a pseudo Tree of Life sort of a thing, but like without Lebetsky. So it's like, and they don't really seem to understand why they're doing that, other than I guess that's what we're supposed to do now. It was kind of adding a superficiality to a story that really needed realness and emotion, to such an effect that when these big emotional scenes would happen, it was so obvious what was going to happen at the beginning of the scene, what was going to happen at the end. I was often annoyed that I had to sit through the process of watching them get there, like they're really gonna blow my fucking mind and make me cry, but like it was so poorly done, and so done in such an obvious way that I knew what was going to happen, so it wasn't tugging at my heartstrings. It was more like making my brain go, oh, okay, so I see what you're doing, but not in like a great genre way, more of like a paint by numbers, this is how you have a big emotional scene kind of a way. And I think Lion never really got past that on a filmmaking level to make this film as special and as amazing as this true story is, and the kind of film that this true story deserves. It's definitely held back by its weaker direction and bad story structure, particularly in the second half, that almost doesn't really understand exactly the kind of film it's telling. It just understands the genre of the kind of film it's telling, and it makes the superficial elements to it far more important than actually telling the story. A boy named Saru, who loves hanging out with his brother Gadu. Gadu is going to work at night, and Saru insists on coming with him because he can lift heavy things and he thinks he can work at night as well. But when they arrive on the train station at night, Saru is too tired, so Gadu lets Saru sleep at night on the train station, and then he goes off to do his work and says, I'll come back for you. When Saru wakes up, he seemingly either doesn't remember this or is confused and starts walking around, and then winds up on a train where he falls asleep, ends up over 100, I believe it's about 180 kilometers from where that train station was, and lost, and in a different part of India where they're speaking a different language, and he can't find his way home, and eventually is put into a foster home and given up for adoption, and adopted by an Australian couple who raise him and another adopted boy until 20 years later when he is older, and he hangs out with a bunch of other kids of Indian descent and is reminded of his upbringing, and at the same time learns about Google Earth and starts trying to figure out where he actually came from and hopefully find his mother and his brother, which is all based on a real life story about how he used Google Earth to be reunited with his biological family. The first part of this film, where you see Saru as a young boy, acted by Sunny Pawar, who does an amazing job. He's probably actually my favorite performance in the film. It's kind of unfair that everyone's like, Dev Patel's really come into his own. I'm like, forget that. This kid is the star for me, and I think he's an amazing actor. Not just an amazing kid actor, he does a great performance, and he's really like kind of the lead of probably more of the movie than Dev Patel, although that part felt really long, so it might have been longer, I don't know. He was really good and really fantastic. It did remind me a bit of, in a Spielberg-esque way, more more like Spielberg produced. It didn't have the mastery of the camera, certainly, that Spielberg has. That part I really liked, but then when you get into the second part of the film, it kind of shows its shaggy storytelling and how it doesn't exactly know what kind of a film it's telling. Now, I think that section works a lot better because they almost understand what that story has to tell. It has to set up, the second part, and it has to tell a certain thing. And the second part of this film doesn't have a distinctness about its storytelling. A particular problem I have with this film is the adoptive brother that Saru has, who has, various mental issues and such, and that's not, I don't have a problem with that, and I'm sure that is how he grew up and who was in his life and such, but it doesn't really do anything for the story. In fact, I kept wondering, what does this have to do with anything almost immediately, and it never went anywhere. I understand there are certain people in your life, but that doesn't mean it connects to the rest of the narrative. The story of your morning might be amazing, but I don't need to see you go to the bathroom. One of this film's major problem is why is he in this at all? I just don't understand what that was doing. We have a teary scene with Nicole Kidman, probably could have been in there without the brother. I honestly think you could cut the brother out of the film and it would make the film better and smoother, and it wouldn't have hurt the narrative at all, because this film is about Saru finding his family, the idea of an adoptive family and adoptive parents. I understand the brother's part of that family, but in terms of this film, it added nothing, and in fact it added an extra piece of drama that the film just did not need. And there's a lot of times where anything that's not dealing with its main narrative, it has a hard time wrestling with, particularly Rooney Mara, who I don't think that really ever works, and why is she even in such a nothing role? But it kind of shows this film is not very good at doing things, that it doesn't wrap up in its main point, which is him figuring out where he was from in India and such, and it keeps bringing to mind why do we have this in there? This director kept holding himself back with all these extra details. That's one of the things I loved about Hidden Figures, is it understood, oh hey, you don't know a lot of this stuff, so we can pace it out, but it was better at structuring it and doing it in an entertaining way, and I got that information, I understood it, and I remember it very well. Lion, I felt it was kind of going in tangents that didn't really work. It was trying to do this quick cutting, moving the camera thing that Malick often does, but it's not being mysterious and metaphorical, it's just being showy and stylish. The storytelling just doesn't really make a distinct point with itself, and is trying to be overly artistic in certain sections, and I understand it's doing a kind of a story and an adoption story, an amazing story about after growing up in Tasmania and finding, his parents, and that's an amazing story, but I don't really think Lion connects more than just telling that story, and can be the amazing piece of filmmaking to be more than this story. In a way, it's wow, this story's amazing, let's talk about that. Do you want to talk about the movie? Other than the kid part, not really. I think Dev Patel is a decent enough actor. He certainly bulked up for this. I don't think this is his mastery big, showy performance. I think, really he's good in it. I don't particularly like anyone other than the younger Saru, I think is the real standout. Nicole Kidman has a big emotional kind of almost should say Oscar clip under it kind of a scene, but this film is just a weaker kind of Oscar-y, Weinstein's produced kind of a movie. It's not the kind of film that I'm going to see for good filmmaking. Its lack of storytelling and clarity is really what held it back for me. I think this is a good story. I think this film could have been maybe even 20 minutes shorter and more distinct about itself, rather than just caring about the emotions of this movie, but not thinking about what those emotions were even saying. It's like watching a messy storyteller who will probably defend and say, oh, well, that happened, and you go, okay, cool, that might have happened, but how is how that happened helping your story and helping your film? And I never really got a sense of that throughout watching Lion. I got a sense of, we have to capture everything how it happened, but life and movies are two different mediums and stuff, and you should maybe adapt them in a certain way. And this film felt at least trying to tell its story rather weaker. Stylistically, I think this film very much falls off when it does the second section of the film. It just never really becomes much more. It's a very stylish, very well produced TV movie, and now that movies and films and theaters are not as separate anymore, why is this even in theaters, and couldn't this have played on HBO on a Saturday or something? Because the filmmaking isn't that much necessarily better, and is kind of playing in that kind of a away. Like, we need to tell all these pieces of the story or people will get mad at us. But I think what they ended up doing is making a film that will leave you much more unsatisfied than anything else. Now, you know, you could say I have like no soul because like everyone else was like crying in the theater, and I was like, I mean, I kind of saw this coming, guys. And I felt a lot of stuff ends up being a lot more unearned just because it took too long. So like any part where you're gonna get emotional, its sappiness and its cliche, the film robbed that from me completely. I think stories like this should be told, and I think there's probably an interesting film out of this, but Lion isn't it. And this director, apparently he's a TV director, but I don't really particularly like him that much. I think the opening section shows a lot of promise, and I really like that part, but it doesn't sing as well. I think he's best when he stays on the plot and on the story and isn't going into like, let's have this character, and I'm like, why? And the film doesn't have an answer because there's not one there. And it's not being a weird art movie, it's just a failure of storytelling. One of its biggest issues really is it just fails at telling a story. This film is about someone finding someone. Then the second part of this film especially never really found what its distinct point is. When this director's on a distinct point, that's why that opening is so much stronger, because it knows like what it's telling and so forth. There's certain parts that aren't as important for the overall story, but they're not as glaring as the second section. Now that I'm thinking about it and talking about it, I can think of a few, but I think generally, I think this film was just a little too loose and shaggy, which is interesting was the wine scenes, because remember when they like cut stuff down, because I really wish they had with this. This is a film that needed a better editor. There might be a much better film in here. The way he presented it and told it, it's almost like you have an amazing story and they relied far too much on that to guide you through this kind of weaker direction that just kind of expects you to follow it on scenes that go on way too long to accomplish something that just like robs it of its real sentimentality in terms of how it's telling its story. The storytelling of this film really hindered it, and I think this is a film that particularly just needed to be cut down and never really entirely connected with me. I kept thinking about how amazing this story is and how much weaker this film is, and I don't think this movie really ever could really recover from that, because there's not, honestly, in terms of filmmaking, all that much there. This is the weepy Oscar movie of this season. I'm probably as interested in this as you probably are at still pretending like you're gonna buy that DVD copy of Frost Nixon at the 7-Eleven. These are films that don't live on because they don't have the filmmaking to get them there. And Lion, it just falls in line with all those kind of movies and doesn't become anything more, and especially doesn't end up becoming more than the story itself. And the story itself is amazing, and I suggest you look at the 60 Minutes piece or something like that, because nothing this film does even close to lives up to that and is able to give it more spirit and make the story go on further than that. It ends up just kind of falling short, just becoming your standard kind of weepy Oscar bait kind of a movie, and that's probably one of the more boring things that any filmmaking year can produce. So if you have seen Lion and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.